The Age of Reason, a Golden Age. The 18th century in England is generally regarded as a golden age, and what's called Augustan after the period of Roman history which had achieved political civility and power, as well as a flourishing of the arts. It was an important moment in the making of modern England, thanks to cultural innovation and public debate. There was a rejection of extremism in all its form. Superstition, fanaticism, verbal violence. The virtues of politeness, moderation and rationality were commonly praised. The third Earl of Shaftesbury was the philosopher of politeness. In his works, characteristic of man, manners, opinions, times, he claimed that man has an innate sense of what is right and wrong, and that virtue lies in good breeding, learning correct social behavior from childhood. The Spectator, a newspaper founded by Joseph Addison, made politeness fashionable with its mixture of news, literature, conversation, and moral exhortation. The art of pleasing, that is, civility and moderation, became the 18th century ideal. Morality and fashion demanded simplicity and emotional authenticity. This influenced the emerging of the figure of the gentleman. However, there was also a counterculture which developed a taste for manly sports such as boxing, racing, and fox hunting, which became an important overall social life. There was a growing tendency towards material gain, individual happiness, and pleasure as the main objectives of life. English women were more independently active in social and cultural life than women on the continent. They visited friends, attended the theatres and coffee houses where they were previously banned. Some began a writing career, like Aphra Behn, who was a pioneer playwright novelist, one of the first professional women writers. Women readers and writers influenced the rise of the novel as the most distinctive literary genre of the period. They did not want to read stories about heroes of the past, but about ordinary people of their day. Many early novels were epistolary. This reflected the craze for letter writing as a consequence of the London penny post, a new, cheap and efficient postal service created in 1680. Access books increased with the spread of circulating libraries and book clubs, as well as with the reduction of book prices. Enlightened thinkers not only wanted to understand the world, but to improve it. They reject the Calvinist belief that every event of life is controlled by God or the devil. A new optimistic view of the natural world, so it is benign and beautiful rather than decayed and corrupted by sin. Nature meant human nature and the physical environment, but it also extended to the universe beyond the earth. It was seen as the complex system or set of principles divinely ordained and manifested in the creation. The response to nature changed. It became emotional and moral. There was a new taste for landscape paintings, which came to be regarded as a typical English genre. This rational age aimed at improving nature, as it did with human society. The English garden was invented, a carefully planned space that expressed values such as freedom, simplicity and balance. English gardens were copied all over Europe, from Versailles to St. Petersburg. The common and uncultivated lands were enclosed and improved, so that the English landscape began to take its modern form as a huge commercialized garden, where the principles of the Enlightenment were in practice. The harmony between man and nature, as well as the hierarchical organization of gentry estates and tenant farm. The new optimism and the belief that reason could improve society and discover new horizons encouraged aspiration. Voyages to new lands were commissioned to Captain Cook by the Royal Society, which led to the encounter with native people uncorrupted by civilization and to the mapping of Australia, New Zealand, and the Hawaiian island. The Enlightenment, as you know, was a European intellectual movement that developed in the 17th and 18th centuries with the aim of freeing man's mind from ignorance, superstition, and obscurantism through knowledge and science. It was generally agreed that ignorance and superstition were spread and maintained among the common people by those who held power and wanted to keep them subjected. Enlightenment was characterized by faith in reason in order to achieve happiness. Reason questioned traditional doctrines, especially religious assumption. Reason was developed by education, and education became a catalyst of social and political change. The movement was rooted in the 17th century scientific revolution and the theories developed by John Locke and Isaac Newton. The critique of traditions and of historical institution led to the creation of an alternative ideal, the state of nature. Enlightened thinkers aimed at discovering the original natural state, since what is natural is also rational and common to every human being. Taste for nature and man's primary state were at the roots of the interest in exotic and savage civilizations. In the figure of the noble savage, he was a child of innocence who worshipped his God in simple faith and obeyed the laws of Mother Nature. From a literary point of view, the Restoration was a period of innovation. Verse rejected complexity in favor of classical simplicity. The eccentricities of metaphysical conceits were replaced by order and clarity as a result of the exercise of reason. The real war with its social events, its ethics and ideals, became the main object of interest. The true spirit of Restoration poetry was satiric. While this was due to the study and translation of classic writers like Horace, Martial, and Juvenal, John Dryden was the main poet whose work established the tone and rules of the poetry of the age. As for prose, the rational tendencies of the Restoration were to be seen both in the works of rationalist philosophers John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and in scientific studies of Newton. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke insisted that the prime and fundamental source of human knowledge of the world outside was individual experience, which could be achieved through the sciences and was not innate. Experience and reason could not be separated. Hobbes defended absolute monarchy in Leviathan, in the belief that private individual selfishness had to be controlled by public force. Isaac Newton published his laws of motions and universal gravitation in his work Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. The new scientific attitude encouraged self-confidence and a belief in human progress. At the same time, it freed the minds of man from fear and superstition and neglected the imagination. The Royal Society set up a committee in 1664 to examine and improve the English language, which was accorded greater importance by the decision to record the experiment in English rather than in Latin. Important prose writers or writers of this period were the diarists John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, who provided insights into the daily life of their time. The restoration of the Stuart dynasty marked a decisive reaction against Puritan morals, which had led to the closing down of the theatres. Theatre was made legal again in 1660, and a period of great change in the style of plays, acting and type of audience began. Restoration theatres were roofed and artificially lit with candles. There were full slides, a drop curtain, and painted movable scenery at the back of the stage for the most important scenes in a play. The audience sat in the dark, in galleries, and on benches or even on boxes in the pit, which was not, as it had been in the Elizabethan theatre, the place for the groundlings, but became now a very fashionable place to be seated. The prices of performances varied, but were mainly expensive. The period witnessed the advent of actresses playing female roles, and actors were tied to the theatre by contract. The audience belonged to the upper classes, whereas Elizabethan audiences had been drawn from all classes. People were used to go to the theatre not only to see brilliant comedies but also to meet other people and to feel fashionable. The best literary expression of Restoration drama was the comedy of manners, which excited Lothar by making fun of the manners and absurdities of an artificial, highly sophisticated society. In a comedy of manners, characters were more likely to be types than individuals. A new type of male character was created. The fop was generally elegant, witty but cynical, and opposed to the gallant or fortunate lover. The heroine was witty and more interested in fashion than in morals. The plot often involved clever handling of situation and intrigue, but it was less important than atmosphere, dialogue and satire. The use of prose dialogue, rather than rhymed verse, increased realism on the stage. The other realistic element of the comedy of manners was the theme of marriage, devoid of any feelings but mainly linked to sex and money. The most important playwrights of Restoration comedy were William Wycherley, whose masterpiece was The Country Wife, and William Congreve. The literature of the Augustan age reflected the economic and intellectual progress of the period, which was characterized by a remarkable output and a growing interest in reading. Reading as an occupational activity had been limited by the low level of literacy. In the country, farmers and laborers were quite illiterate, while in the towns literacy was limited by the few schools and the early living age. Books were expensive and a luxury the lower classes couldn't afford. For them there were cheaper forms of printed materials like ballads, chapbooks, pamphlets and newspapers, where short stories and novels were published in serial form. Landing or circulating libraries led to an increase in the reading public, particularly among middle and upper class women, who had the luxury of leisure time. The growing importance of the middle classes, both in the political and social field, had a strong influence on literature, encouraging the rise of prose. Belief in the power of reason and in the individual's trust in his own ability found expression in the novel and in journalism. The idea of the reason could be used to analyze the world, but was analyzing itself at the same time, was the basis of the parody and satire in Swift's and Fielding's novels, which were also a critique of different aspects of rationality. Puritan morality still played a leading role in the life of many middle-class readers, and both Defoe and Richardson combined religious and secular interests in their works. This compromise was the most important trend in the 18th century literature and found its earliest expression in the establishment of periodicals, such as Addison's The Spectacle. In the field of criticism, Samuel Johnson was a major figure. His prefaces to Shakespeare and Lives of the Poets were his best works. However, its greatest achievement was the Dictionary of English Language by Johnson in 1755. So, breaking away from metaphysical poetry, the poet saw his role as one of providing social poetry with models of refined behavior. A classical pattern was adopted where poems didn't express the poet's personal feelings, and even dissent was written with detachment. Satire and mock-heroic verse was still in the favorite techniques for criticism and moral concern. Mock-heroic poems in particular dealt with the trivial subject in the heroic style of an epic, achieving a comic effect. The principle expounded by Latin poet Horace in his Ars Poetica greatly influenced Augustan poets. They used poetic diction, standard phrases, and periphrases for everyday object, apostrophe inversion, and personification, as well as Latinized words and construction. The middle classes joined the theatre-going public, and London audiences began to enjoy pantomime. a kind of ballad opera, a mixture of political satire, picaresque adventures and love interest. John Gay wrote The Beggar's Opera, where the characters are rogues and vagabonds and get by jesting and exaggerating create a fantastic world. The Restoration comedy of manners was replaced by the sentimental comedy dealing with everyday problems in simple language, where virtue triumphs over vice. But now let's see the rise of novel. Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson are generally regarded as the fathers of the English novel, though they did not constitute a literary school. The 18th century novelist was the spokesman of the middle class. The novel was primarily concerned with everything that could affect social status, and it was mainly directed to a bourgeois public. The class which had traditionally formed the backbone of English literature for centuries, plots taken from history, legend and mythology, were abandoned. The writer's primary aim was no longer to satisfy the standards of patrons and the literacy elite, but to write in a simple way in order to be understood even by less well-educated readers. Since it was the booksellers and not the patron who rewarded the writer, speed and copiousness became the most important economic virtues. The story was particularly appealing to the practical-minded tradesman, who was self-made and self-reliant. The sense of reward and punishment, which was the message of the novel itself, was related to the Puritan ethics of the middle classes. Yet some hints at social justice can be found in Defoe. The writer aimed at realism. He tried to portray different human experiences, and not only those suited to one particular literary perspective. The realism of the novel was linked not to the kind of life presented, but to the way a life experience was presented. The subject of the novel was always the bourgeois man and his problems. He was a well-defined character and the hero of the narrative. He was generally the mouthpiece of his author, and the reader was expected to sympathize with him. All the characters struggled either for survival or social success, and they could be divided into two groups. The former was composed of people who believed in reason, like Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The latter, by those who cannot control their passion and subordinate reason to their desires, like Defoe's Moll Flanders. The fact that characters were given contemporary names and surnames was sometimes new and served to reinforce the impression of realism. The writer was omnipresent. He chose either the third-person narrator, who was omniscient and never abandoned his characters, or the first-person narrator, who was the main character in the story. A chronological sequence of events was generally adopted by the novelist. Characters seems to be very much rooted in a temporal dimension, and references were made to particular times of the year or of the day. Great attention was paid to the setting, where the action happened became a question of much concern and was the logical complement to time. Time and place were considered two different aspects of the same reality. In previous fiction, the idea of place had been vague and fragmentary, but in the new novel, specific references to names of streets and town, surnames, together with detailed description of interiors, had to render the narrative even more realistic. The 18th century novel developed different subgenres. The realistic novel, such as the Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which focuses on realistic description of time and place. The utopian novel, with Jonathan Swift and his Gulliver's Travel, shows imaginary nations with strange new societies and peoples employed to satirize contemporary English society. The epistolary novel, with Samuel Richard's son Pamela, is told through letters exchanged between different characters. The picaresque novel, Aristophanes' Tom Jones, is episodic in structure and it concerned the adventures of a young hero who has to deal with his tyrannical master and misfortunes, but generally managed to escape this situation by using his wit. And then finally, the anti-novel, Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, shows that the orderly narratives of events have little relation to the disorder of human mind, which is not linked to a logical sequence of events.